The morning air was bitter and gray, thick with the distant scent of hay and rusted iron. Crows gathered like shadows on the railings above the auction yard, their caws echoing through the valley like a warning. Men barked bids over the noise of stamping hooves. Old trucks idled in the dirt, and somewhere nearby, a colt whinnied and wasn't answered. The place reeked of endings. A small girl stood on the edge of it all, silent and unmoving. Her coat hung off her like it had been made for someone twice her size, the sleeves hiding her hands, the collar buttoned up to her chin. Her wide brown eyes flicked across the pen, never settling. She didn't speak. She hadn't for months. Not since the fire. Not since her world shrank to this silence. And the only voice she knew anymore was her grandfather's. He stood beside her, weathered hands stuffed deep into his pockets, eyes narrowed against the cold. He wasn't a tall man, but next to the girl, he seemed impossibly solid. A man made of dirt and stubbornness, with lines etched into his face like tree bark. He didn't say much either. Not out of grief. His grief was a quiet, settled thing, but out of understanding. Words were heavy now, and neither of them had the strength to carry more than necessary. The auctioneer called for attention. "All right, folks, next up, well, I'll be honest. I'd pay someone just to haul this one out of here." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. The next horse was dragged into the center ring. He was thin to the point of collapse, every bone outlined under his dull brown coat. Scars crisscrossed his flank, one ear twisted from an old injury. He limped badly, favoring his left front leg, and his eyes had no shine. Someone muttered, "Should have been put down already." The little girl tugged her grandfather's coat. He looked down, surprised. She hadn't moved since they'd arrived. She pointed toward the horse. "No," he said softly. "Not that one. He's finished, Em." She didn't lower her hand. "Look, we've only got enough for one. There'll be better ones." But she kept staring. Her eyes locked with the horse's, and something passed between them. Quiet, invisible, undeniable. A flicker of recognition, maybe. Or something older. Like two broken things recognizing each other in the crowd. He sighed. "You're sure?" She nodded once. The bidding started and ended in less than 10 seconds. $1. The grandfather called. No one countered. The auctioneer shook his head, but dropped the gavel. Sold to the old man and the little ghost beside him. They led the horse out back. He stumbled and nearly fell. Emily, her name barely used now, even by those who loved her, walked toward him as he collapsed in the dirt. He wheezed, too exhausted to even stand, and for a moment, her grandfather moved forward, ready to stop her. But she knelt slowly, carefully, and placed her small hand on the horse's sunken face. The horse flinched, but he didn't pull away. Back at the farm, everything creaked. The wind slipped through the wooden slats of the barn, brushing over stacked hay bales and rusted tools. The old house sat hunched on the hill, like it was watching the land shrink beneath its feet. They laid down straw in the stall, gave the horse water, and tried oats soaked in molasses. He refused them all. Emily didn't speak, but every hour she came and sat beside him. She would sketch in her notepad, pages filled with crooked horses, flames, hands reaching, and show him each one. Sometimes she left the drawings pinned on his stall. He didn't look, but he listened. On the 4th night, as the wind howled and her grandfather snored in his recliner by the stove, Emily slipped out barefoot into the barn. The floor was freezing, but she didn't notice. She climbed into the stall, curled up beside the horse, and began to hum. It was barely more than a breath. The melody came from memory, a lullaby her mother used to sing when the storms came too close. Her voice trembled, but the horse lifted his head. He looked at her, not through her, and something in his body shifted, just slightly. The next morning, he ate the oats. Grandfather watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "Might be luck," he muttered. "Might be something else." The days grew longer. Emily brushed him with gentle strokes. She learned to move slow, speak with her hands, trust the silence between them. He flinched less each time. She named him Whiskey, after the color of his eyes, when the light hit just right. It took weeks before her grandfather stopped calling him that bag of bones. One afternoon, Emily found a magazine in the shed, years old, pages curled from damp. On the cover was a photo, a proud horse mid-spin, his rider raising one hand in victory. His markings were different, his body younger and whole, but the eyes were the same. Whiskey had been someone once. She tore out the page and tacked it to the barn wall. That night, she whispered the first words she'd spoken aloud in nearly half a year. "I know you're still in there." Whiskey blinked. His ears twitched. He lowered his head into her arms. Her grandfather saw it all through the slats of the barn door. He didn't say anything, but he turned back toward the house with something tight in his chest that hadn't been there in a long time. The next morning, Emily drew a picture of Whiskey, tall and strong, galloping across a field. She taped it beside the magazine page and kissed his scarred forehead. "You're coming back," she said. The wind outside carried the scent of rain. Far in the distance, thunder rumbled. Whiskey turned his head toward the open door, eyes alert, ears forward. For the first time since the auction, he took a step without stumbling. And Emily smiled. The sun rose pale and reluctant the next morning, casting a soft orange glow across the frost-tipped grass. Whiskey stood at the edge of the paddock, motionless except for the slow flick of his tail. His ribs still showed, and his limp had not disappeared, but there was something different in his posture, an alertness, a fragile kind of pride. Emily stood by the fence with a rope halter in her hands. She didn't speak, didn't whistle, didn't coax. She simply waited. Whiskey watched her. Then, with a tentative step, he closed the distance on his own. It wasn't just healing. It was something else. Trust, perhaps. A silent agreement that whatever pain still clung to them both, they would face it together. The next few weeks became routine. Quiet mornings, soft grooming, sketchbook pages taped to the stall door, and slow walks along the fence line. Emily led him gently, one hand on the rope, the other always ready to steady or soothe. He stumbled sometimes, but he never stopped trying. Her grandfather began leaving feed without a word. He'd linger near the barn, not interfering, but close enough to step in if needed. Sometimes he watched Emily trace the outline of Whiskey's old magazine photo, her pencil lines shaking but determined. He wanted to tell her not to hope too hard. He wanted to say that broken things rarely fit back the same, but the words never made it past his lips. Then Clara arrived. She was older than Emily's grandfather, with hair the color of storm clouds and boots that looked like they'd walked through 3 wars. She drove a dented truck that rattled like loose bones and wore silence like armor. She came to deliver hay but stayed longer than usual, standing quietly outside the paddock, arms crossed. "Where'd you find that one?" she finally asked, nodding at Whiskey. "Auction," the old man replied. "He's got fire in him, hidden under all that mess." Clara leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "That horse used to dance. I'd swear it." Emily appeared beside Whiskey, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Clara looked at her, then at the notebook tucked under her arm. "She don't speak?" Clara asked gently. The grandfather shook his head. "She does now, but mostly to him." Clara's expression softened, and she stepped closer. Whiskey didn't back away. "I trained rodeo horses for 30 years, she said. "I can tell when one's been through hell and come back hungry. He's not done. Neither is she." Later that day, Clara returned with a faded training rope and a tattered book of old routines. She didn't take over. She simply watched, offered suggestions, and taught Emily with nods and demonstrations. She treated Whiskey like a partner, not a project. Emily absorbed it all. She learned how to guide with her hips, not just her hands. She began riding bareback in the mornings, just short walks at first, then wider circles in the field. Whiskey responded to her cues like he'd been waiting for them all along. But progress wasn't smooth. Some days, Whiskey refused to move. Other times, he startled at shadows or flinched at the touch of the saddle. There were moments when Emily cried silently into his mane, frustrated and exhausted. Her grandfather wanted to intervene, but Clara shook her head. She asked to feel it. Let her. And she did. She learned to listen with her whole body. She stopped pushing and started asking. And Whiskey, scarred as he was, began to answer with quiet resilience. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low in the sky, The old man returned from town with a flyer clutched in his hand. He laid it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before calling Emily over. It was for the local youth rodeo, an event he'd once taken her mother to decades ago. The flyer listed several categories, including showmanship for young riders. "She'd have wanted you to go," he said, his voice low and rough. "But this isn't a game, Em. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, not even to him." Emily studied the paper. Then she looked out the window toward the barn, where Whiskey stood watching the horizon. She turned back and gave a single, firm nod. It wasn't about winning. It was about being seen, about proving that neither of them were lost causes. That night, thunder rolled over the hills. Rain lashed the tin roof, and wind howled through the cracks in the wood. Whiskey panicked, thrashing in his stall, eyes wide and white showing. Lightning flashed, and a sudden crack sent him rearing back. Emily rushed into the barn barefoot, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face. She slipped once, caught herself, and crawled under the stall gate. She knelt in the straw and reached up with both arms, wrapping them around Whiskey's trembling neck. His breathing slowed. She pressed her forehead to his and whispered, voice shaking, "You're not alone anymore." He lowered his head and stood still, letting the storm pass around them. By morning, the barn smelled of damp earth and hope. Emily was asleep in the straw, her hand resting on Whiskey's side. When she opened her eyes, he was already watching her. They began training with purpose after that, each session built toward the rodeo. Clara showed Emily how to polish movements, how to ride with posture and pride. They practiced transitions, circles, spins. Not perfect, never perfect, but with growing harmony. Whiskey's limp never fully disappeared, but he carried himself differently now, like he remembered what it meant to be whole. As the day of the competition approached, neighbors started to stop by, curious. They watched the little girl on the scarred horse and shook their heads. "No way they're ready," one whispered. "They've already won," Clara replied. "You just don't see it yet." Emily didn't care what anyone said. She rode not for applause, but for something deeper, for the silence she'd crawled out of, for the fire that had stolen everything, for the way Whiskey had looked at her that first day. Empty and fading. Now, when he looked at her, there was light. The night before the rodeo, Emily hung a final drawing in Whiskey's stall. It showed him and her standing side by side beneath a glowing sky. No ribbons, no arena, just them. She kissed his nose, ran her fingers down his scar, and whispered, "We're ready." Whiskey blinked slowly, then nudged her shoulder with his muzzle. The wind outside had stilled. The storm was over, and something new was waiting at sunrise. The morning of the rodeo arrived like a held breath, still, hushed, full of weight. Mist clung to the low hills, turning the distant trees into ghosts. Emily stood in the barn, brushing Whiskey's coat with steady, patient strokes. He stood calmly, ears flicking with each distant sound, but he didn't tremble. Not anymore. His ribs still showed, though not as sharply. The limp was there, subtle but stubborn. Yet the way he held himself now, head lifted, eyes alert, was entirely different. Her grandfather entered, a clean flannel shirt tucked into old jeans, his worn hat resting on his head like armor. He didn't say much. He rarely did, but his eyes held something soft when he looked at her, pride tempered by caution. "You don't have to go through with it," he said. Emily tightened the strap on Whiskey's halter. Then she looked at him, eyes unwavering. "Yes, I do." He nodded once. That was all. They loaded Whiskey into the trailer slowly. The same rusted trailer that hadn't been used in years, its hinges squealing like it remembered better days. Whiskey stepped inside without resistance, trusting her completely. The drive to the fairgrounds was quiet. Trees blurred past the windows as the world woke up. The closer they got, the tighter Emily's hands became on the folds of her dress. She looked out the window, lips pressed tight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Her grandfather kept one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally brushing over the old flyer folded on the dashboard. When they arrived, the fairgrounds were already buzzing. Trucks lined the gravel lot. Horses whinnied in distant pens. Loudspeakers crackled with announcements. Children in polished boots and bright ribbons ran between trailers. their parents bustling with nervous energy. Emily stepped out slowly. She looked small beside the others, her dress simple, boots scuffed, hair pulled into a loose braid. But she walked tall. Whiskey emerged from the trailer and drew stares almost immediately. His scars, the faint hitch in his step, the faded coat, it all marked him as different. Some parents frowned. A few competitors whispered behind cupped hands. But Emily didn't notice. Or maybe she did, but chose not to care. Clara arrived not long after, her truck pulling in with a sputter. She walked over with her usual quiet confidence, glanced at Whiskey, then at Emily, and simply said, "You're late." Emily smiled. It was faint but real. The showmanship category was scheduled second. They had just under an hour to prepare. Clara helped with the final brushing, smoothing Whiskey's coat as much as possible, while Emily polished his hooves and adjusted his tack. There was no glitter, no flashy gear. Just effort, just care. When their number was called, Emily took a deep breath and led Whiskey into the arena. The crowd wasn't huge, but it was loud. Cameras clicked. Judges sat behind a long table, expressions unreadable. At the far end, a woman with a clipboard waved them into position. Emily walked Whiskey in a straight line, pivoted cleanly, then walked again. She stopped at the judge's signal, squared his stance, and stepped back. Every movement was deliberate. Every gesture came from hours of silent practice. Somewhere behind the fence, her grandfather stood watching. He didn't cheer. He didn't wave. But his fingers gripped the brim of his hat tightly. Then came the questions. The judge stepped forward and asked Emily about Whiskey's breed, his care routine, how she'd prepared. Her voice didn't falter. She answered clearly, respectfully. When they asked how long she'd owned him, she paused. Since the day no one else wanted him, she said quietly. The judge looked at Whiskey, then back at her, nodding once. They completed the pattern and walked to the edge of the ring. They weren't the fastest or the most polished, but they were precise, connected. The way Emily looked at Whiskey, with deep, unshakable belief, wasn't something that could be rehearsed. The results wouldn't be announced until later, but Emily didn't wait for ribbons. She untacked Whiskey slowly, whispering as she worked. "You did it," she said. "You were perfect." Whiskey nuzzled her shoulder in response. Nearby, a few of the other competitors approached, curiosity in their steps. A girl with a perfectly groomed palomino asked, "What happened to his leg?" Emily paused, unsure how to answer. But then she said, "He was broken, like me, but we're both still standing." The girl blinked, then nodded. "He's cool." That afternoon, clouds rolled in, the light dimming just slightly. When the results were posted, Emily walked to the board with Clara and her grandfather beside her. Her name wasn't first. It wasn't second either. But third place, solid, honest, hard-earned, was written in clear print beside her number. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, staring at the paper, as the wind caught a strand of her hair and tossed it across her face. "You're proud of her," Clara said to the old man. He didn't answer right away. Then, with a gravelly laugh, he said, "She did more than I thought possible. So did that horse." Later, they loaded Whiskey back into the trailer. The crowd thinned. Dust lifted from the road as the sun began to sink. As they drove away, Emily looked back at the arena one last time. Then she turned to her grandfather and whispered, "I think Mama would have liked him." He didn't speak, just reached over and squeezed her hand. The barn was quiet when they got home. Emily led Whiskey to a stall, removed the halter, and sat down in the straw beside him. She pulled out her sketchbook and flipped to a fresh page. This time, she didn't draw scars or storms or sorrow. She drew a field, open, bright, and in it, a girl on a horse with fire in his eyes. She pinned it to the stall wall, beside all the others, and whispered, "This is just the beginning." Outside, the stars began to blink through the fading light. And for the first time in months, the silence between girl and horse wasn't empty. It was full of promise. 2 weeks passed since the rodeo, and the barn had never felt so alive. Emily no longer counted the days in silence. She marked them in sketches, each one capturing a different moment. Whiskey stepping confidently through the tall grass, her grandfather watching from the porch with quiet awe, Clara adjusting a saddle with calloused hands and a satisfied smirk. These images weren't fantasies anymore. They were memories. Still, something stirred in Emily, an unfinished chord waiting to be resolved. Whiskey had healed in body and spirit, but Emily sensed his restlessness. Every morning, he greeted her with bright eyes and an eager nicker. He was no longer the broken shell she had rescued. He was becoming something else. And deep inside, she knew. He needed more than the quiet barn. He needed to run again. To prove, if not to others, then to himself, that he was still capable of more. That thought frightened her. What if the world outside this quiet little life shattered him again? What if it shattered her? Her grandfather noticed her unease. One evening, as she brushed whiskey beneath the setting sun, he came to lean against the gate, arms folded across his chest. He cleared his throat and tilted his head toward the field beyond the fence. There's a wild run next county over. Real open land. Clara says folks let their horses stretch their legs there sometimes. He paused. Might be good for him. Good for you, too. Emily tightened her grip on the brush, her voice barely above a whisper. What if he gets hurt? Her grandfather looked at her, eyes weathered but kind. What if he flies? They left at dawn the next morning. The trailer bumped along the dirt roads, past golden fields and swaying trees. Clara led the way in her rattling truck, and Emily sat beside her grandfather, staring out the window. Whiskey rode quietly, his weight steady behind them, as if he understood something important was about to happen. The open run was more beautiful than Emily imagined. Rolling hills, untouched meadows, and a sky that seemed to stretch forever. A few horses galloped in the distance, manes whipping in the wind like flags of freedom. It was a place for those who remembered how to run. Emily hesitated as she led Whiskey out of the trailer. He stepped onto the grass slowly, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. The wind carried scents of wildflowers, earth, and something ancient, something free. Clara walked up beside Emily and offered her a small nod. Let him choose. Emily unclipped the lead rope. For a moment, Whiskey didn't move. He turned his head, looking at her as if asking for permission. Her heart pounded. It's okay, she said gently. You can go. Whiskey blinked once, then stepped forward. He walked to the edge of the hill, the wind rippling through his mane, then broke into a slow trot. The trot became a lope, the lope a gallop. Emily watched as he ran, not away, but toward something. His limp barely showed. He ran as if the world had never heard him, hooves pounding the ground in rhythm with her heartbeat. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks. Her grandfather laid a hand on her shoulder. That's the same horse you brought home. She shook her head. No, she whispered. It's the horse I always knew was in there. Whiskey circled back after several minutes, breath heaving, sweat darkening his coat, but his eyes gleamed with fire. He walked straight to Emily, rested his head against her chest, and let out a long, contented sigh. They stayed like that for a long time, girl and horse, quiet and complete. Later that evening, back at the barn, Emily sat in the hayloft sketching the moment. Her lines were fluid now, no longer trembling. Her images didn't just capture shape, they captured spirit. Clara joined her, a thermos of tea in hand. You ever thought about showing more? Clara asked. Not just rodeos. Real exhibitions. Places where horses like Whiskey aren't judged for how pretty they are, but for the bond they have with their riders. Emily looked up. Do people even want to see that? Clara smiled. You'd be surprised. A horse that comes back from the edge. A girl who found her voice through trust. That's something the world needs more of. Emily didn't answer right away, but she looked out the window where Whiskey grazed in the fading light and nodded slowly. The idea lingered. In the days that followed, they began preparing, not for judges, not for ribbons, but for stories. Emily and Whiskey practiced with purpose, not just routines, but moments, pauses, glances, whispers. Every movement told a story of loss, healing, and resilience. Clara helped refine the flow, adding subtle cues and patterns that showcased their bond. One night, as Emily and her grandfather sat on the porch, the old man handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a flyer, handwritten, simple, advertising a local equine showcase with a category titled Asterisk, Heart of the Horse. Asterisk. She stared at it for a moment, then looked at him. You really think we're ready? He smiled. You've already done the hardest part. The rest? That's just letting people see what you've become. The event was small, held in a covered arena, surrounded by food trucks and hay bales. But to Emily, it felt monumental. This time, there were no numbered routines, no rigid expectations, just a space to show truth. When their names were called, she walked Whiskey into the ring slowly. The spotlight above them cast long shadows, but neither flinched. She didn't perform tricks. Instead, she moved beside him in silence, brushing her fingers along his side, guiding him with whispers and glances. They weaved, paused, turned. At one point, she dropped the rope entirely, and Whiskey followed her without hesitation. Gasps rose from the crowd, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. At the end, Emily climbed onto his back, bareback, and let him carry her in one slow, graceful loop around the arena. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But her eyes shone. When they exited, the applause was thunderous. Not loud with excitement, but loud with emotion. They didn't win a prize that night, but they were asked to return. For interviews. For features. People wanted to hear the story of the silent girl and the scarred horse who healed each other. And though Emily didn't speak much, when she did, her words mattered. Weeks later, a letter arrived. It was from an organization that traveled across the state, using equine therapy to help children with trauma. They had read about her. They wanted her and Whiskey to visit, to show other kids what trust could look like. Emily held the letter in shaking hands, then looked at Whiskey. He stepped toward her, rested his head against hers, and exhaled. And Emily knew, without doubt, that they weren't done. They were just beginning.